We welcome Tony Leon. I know your time is in demand at this moment in time. Thank you for the moments that you are going to be spending with us. It's appreciated.
Thanks very much, Clarence. Nice to speak to you again.
Yes, indeed. Let's talk about magnanimous. Do we have it within us?
Well, ask me that question in a month or two, and I'll give you a more definitive answer. Look, we're in a very fragile situation right now, not because of any ill will or goodwill by any of the parties, but because we really are, to mix cliches or metaphors, in uncharted territory. You know, everything in our government up until now, for the last 30 years, and in our constitution since 1996, has more or less been predicated that one party would have outright control of parliament and therefore the cabinet and the government itself. And that changed fundamentally in the electoral earthquake of the 29th of May, where the, once impregnable hegemon, the ANC, was, reduced right down the ranks to 40% and cannot form a government, cannot sustain a parliamentary majority with unless it has outside assistance from hitherto opposing parties. And of course, the biggest of those opposition parties is my party, the Democratic Alliance.
I think maybe we should talk about the fracas. The recent fracas plays out in News 24 today. It says the DA says the ANC failed to consult it over the inclusion of Gayton McKenzie's patriotic alliance. That sounds like a pretty non-issue, pretty big non-issue. Why are we creating a mountain out of a molehill?
Well, look, I think it's a question of, are you honor bound by the agreement you entered into? And Clarence, without being inappropriate, this is a radio discussion we're having, and I'm enjoying it. You can't litigate these things always in public because, I think good faith also requires that you talk to your negotiating partners directly. And that is happening and will happen over the next few hours and days. But just on the facts, and I'm not getting into interpretation or making a dispute of them, on Friday morning, the DA and the ANC signed an agreement between themselves on the statement of intent on the government of national unity. And one of the clauses, clause 24, says, and I'm reading from it, in keeping with the spirit of an inclusive government of national unity, it is agreed that the composition of the GNU shall be discussed and agreed amongst the existing parties whenever new parties desire to be part of the GNU. Now, just a matter of fact, once again, not opinion or interpretation, those words appear in an agreement signed by two parties, that is the Democratic Alliance and the ANC, on Friday morning. Whether, in fact, other parties had previously entered into a similar bilateral arrangement with the ANC, I simply can't answer the question. I would have thought, and it was never dealt with directly, it was maybe inferentially discussed, and certainly in the rooms that I was present in, that if it was the intention to bring in a party like the PA as a full-blown partner in the GNU, and I don't know if that is the intention, they would have mentioned it or indeed flagged it in their discussions with the DA.
Local by-election results in Beaufort West suggest that the PA can't retain its constituency 2 years after entering the fray. So I cannot understand why this is such a big issue. And GNU, if it was magnanimous, then an invitation would have been extended to all political parties that came through this election. Was that not the case?
It's not for me. I'm not... I was just recalled to national service for a few weeks. I'm not going to be in that government. So I am literally an interested outsider in all this. It's not for me to say who should be in or outside it. I just think that if you're going to make this thing work over time, not just for the next week or so, you've got to operate in the utmost good faith. And one of, I think, the requirements of good faith is you disclose along the way, well, this is what I'm doing. I know we've signed an agreement with you. We've now signed an agreement with X. And this is what we propose to do. What do you think about it? Now, it could be that those discussions are imminent and they will happen. And I think that's what needs to happen. Because, without going into the weeds of this, Clarence, if you just sort of helicopter out of it a bit, you've got to say that if this is going to work, this brave new world of coalition politics, at a national level in South Africa, the principals need to be engaged with each other frequently and in a direct and an open-hearted fashion. Otherwise, it ain't going to work.
I hear what you're saying. So let's get back to the principle. Was there an invitation extended to all political parties to join the government of national unity?
Well, I think there might have been by the president, and I think there probably was, but I can only speak about the bilateral. There were discussions that I was involved in from the DA side, were the DA and the ANC and the DA and the IFP. Well, the latter were very easy because we have a long history of cooperation and collaborations. That was not a problem, and that's why the only provincial government where a coalition was required in KwaZulu-Natal has really been installed. There's been no dispute about the number of seats in the executive, about positions. It's all happened and it's operating. The only one of the so-called hung provinces where that has actually happened. So I think, the next milepost will be Gauteng, because that's in the process of being negotiated, and one hopes that the same spirit of inclusivity and proportionality we saw in KZN will happen there, and that's a work in progress. And then obviously the big enchilada is the national cabinet, and and I'm not talking about how many parties come in and who participates. We also, as between ourselves and the ANC, and that's really, who the document was signed that I'm referring to, there was an agreement on the principle of broad proportionality applying in the allocation of executive seats.
And that relates or is commensurate with the size of your constituency.
Precisely.
Okay.
So, and the size of your constituency, obviously, I think, you mentioned the by-election results at municipal level in Beaufort West, which were very interesting in the Western Cape.
Absolutely.
But it's the size of your constituency as of the 29th of May, as reflected in the seats in the National Assembly.
Yeah.
That's the, if you like, the reference point for this agreement.
Yeah, and similarly to the Patriotic Alliance can't have half a minister in cabinet.
Well, that's somebody's determination, not mine. But I think that's.
I think the conversations that we have, and I know that you have to go, is around the emotional intelligence that is going to be required to make this a success. With all of your experience and understanding of politics in this country, do you think we have it in place?
Well, I certainly think we have some of the elements in place, but probably not all of them. One of the ANC negotiators said to us at an early meeting, he said, we've got to overcome 30 years of enmity between ourselves, and that's true. It doesn't mean that you go and park in the garage, every policy disagreement, because there are some really fundamental differences of policy, opinion, and approach and philosophy as between the DA and the ANC, and they didn't disappear simply as a result of the election. In some ways, the election intensified them. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, when we were putting our stall up for these negotiations, we thought, well, what are the points of agreement? And there are some points of agreement, maybe just theoretically, and they now need to be fleshed out between the parties. One is on the preservation and enhancement of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights in its entirety, not picking and choosing a few clauses that you agree with and junking those you disagree with, the whole of the Bill of Rights. And we said having a sound economy, and what that implies, issues like the independence of the Reserve Bank, so you preserve your currency and you tamp down on inflation. And thirdly, having the reform agenda as evinced by the president himself in Operation Vulindlela. And actually, there we were in agreement. There were a lot of things we didn't agree on, and we put that forward. Well, here's a basis, at least for cooperation and for possible cooperative governance. And the ANC accepted that, and I might say it's in the statement of intent, and that's a requirement of any party which enters the government of national unity. They've got to sign on that statement. Now, I describe myself in one meeting as a detribalized attorney. So on the one hand, I understand that words have meaning and agreements have consequences. But on the other hand, I'm equally alive to the fact, Clarence, just to answer your broader point, that you cannot go to court and say, we've honored clause 16 of proportionality in the cabinet's appointments, but the ANC hasn't. No court of law here or anywhere else is going to say, okay, we're going to make a finding in favor of the DA and against the ANC or vice versa. This is an agreement which shows a serious intent, but to execute it, to operationalize it, to make it live is going to require the parties, not some outside agency.
The good faith. The good faith. Yeah.
Good.
We appreciate your time, Tony. Leon, hopefully next time we can get more of it, more of your time, and we can exhaust the issues completely.